before the first city rose from the earth, before the first law was carved into stone, before any human hand had ever pressed a mark into soft clay and called it language, there was already a civilization that knew all of those things. They knew the stars, and not merely their names. They knew their distances, their orbits, the long, slow mathematics of the sky that it would take the rest of humanity thousands of years to rediscover. They knew how many planets circled the sun. They knew the shape of those orbits, the deep gravitational order that holds each one in its place. They wrote all of it down with great patience and great care, pressed into clay tablets that were dried and stacked and stored as though someone understood that what was being preserved might one day need to be found again. These were the people of Sumer, the first civilization. The ones who appeared in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, not gradually, not haltingly through the slow accumulation of centuries, but fully formed, complete, as though they had not grown into civilization at all, but had simply arrived with it already in hand. And in their own words, written down and preserved across 5,000 years of silence, they explained how that had happened. They said they had been taught. They said that beings had come to them. Beings who came down from the sky. Beings who carried knowledge of the deep structure of the world and were willing, for reasons of their own, to share a part of it. They called these beings the Anunnaki. It is an old Sumerian phrase, and what it means, in the most careful translation, is simply this: those who from heaven to earth came. Tonight we are going to follow that story. Not as legend and not as metaphor, but as the Sumerians themselves understood it, as history. As the account of what had actually happened, written down so that it would not be forgotten, preserved in clay so that one day, someone might read it and understand. We are going to ask where the Anunnaki came from. We are going to ask why they came. We are going to look at the clock they appear to have left running inside the structure of Sumerian mathematics, a clock that measures not years or centuries but great sweeping cycles of thousands of years, and we are going to ask, quietly, where in that cycle we might be standing right now. There is nothing that requires your attention. The night is long. The world outside is still. And the story we are about to move through together is older than almost anything else our species has managed to remember. Let it carry you gently forward. The man who read the tablets. In 1920, in the city of Baku on the western shore of the Caspian Sea, a child was born who would spend the better part of his life trying to convince the world that it had misread its own oldest story. His name was Zechariah Sitchin. And he was, by most accounts, a careful and methodical man. Not a showman. Not someone who sought attention or controversy for its own sake. He was an editor and journalist by profession, and a linguist by a kind of deep, personal obsession, a man who had spent 30 years, before publishing a single word of his central theory, teaching himself to read Sumerian cuneiform. Not to skim it. Not to glance at it and make reasonable guesses. But to read it the way the people who wrote it had intended it to be read, with all the patience and precision that required. He had come to believe, across all those years of study, that something had gone quietly wrong with the way the tablets had been interpreted. That professional translators and academic scholars, working from a perfectly reasonable set of assumptions, had made a single foundational error that changed the meaning of everything. The error was this: They had assumed the Sumerians were writing mythology. They had assumed that the gods in the texts were invented, that the stories of sky beings and ancient creation and great catastrophe were the poetic imaginings of a pre-scientific people, a culture reaching for explanations of a world it did not yet have the tools to understand. Sitchin looked at the same tablets and saw something different. He saw technical language. He saw astronomical observation written with the specificity of someone who had actually made those observations, not imagined them. He saw planets described in terms that matched their physical reality, including planets that Western science would not officially identify until the 18th and 19th centuries. Neptune, Uranus, bodies that the ancient Sumerians had no reason to know about, by any conventional understanding of what ancient people were capable of knowing. And yet there they were, in the clay, described with quiet accuracy, as though their existence were simply obvious, the kind of fact that required no explanation because everyone already knew it. He published his first book, The 12th Planet, in 1976. The academic world received it in the particular silence that institutions reserve for ideas they find genuinely uncomfortable. The book sold 3 million copies regardless, passed from hand to hand over the following decades, read in quiet hours by people who had always sensed that the official story of where we came from had been leaving something important out. Sitchin went on to write 6 more books, a series he called the Earth Chronicles, each one building on the last, each one adding another layer to the same central argument: that the gods of the ancient world were not supernatural, that they were physical, that they had come from somewhere, arrived here for reasons of their own, and that their presence had shaped the course of human history so completely and so deeply that the traces of it are still visible, if you know what to look for. He died in 2010, at the age of 90, still working, still translating, still convinced that the tablets had something left to say that the world was not yet ready to hear. The tablets, for their part, are still there. In the British Museum in London, in the Oriental Institute in Chicago, in the Louvre in Paris, sitting quietly in their glass cases, waiting, as they have been waiting for 5,000 years, for someone to ask the right questions. What the clay remembers. The Sumerians recorded everything. Their laws, their trade agreements, their love poetry, their medical knowledge, their observations of the night sky, their understanding of the cosmos, their accounts of the gods, all of it pressed carefully into clay, all of it preserved with the same deliberate intention. They were a people who understood, in some deep way, that knowledge unrecorded is knowledge eventually lost. And so they recorded the story of their own beginning. Not in vague or dreamlike language. In the careful, sequential, specific language of people who believed they were writing down what had actually happened. The oldest of the Sumerian creation texts is known as the Enuma Elish. Its title comes from its first words, which means something like in the time before, when above. It describes the formation of our solar system in terms so particular that Sitchin spent years mapping them against modern astronomical data, finding, to his own stated astonishment, that they aligned. In his reading of the text, the Enuma Elish describes a great body entering our young solar system from outside, a massive planet moving in the opposite direction to everything already orbiting the Sun, cutting across the solar plane, pulled gradually into a long elliptical orbit of its own. As it swept through the inner solar system in those early eons, it collided with a protoplanet the Sumerians called Tiamat. The collision was enormous. One half of Tiamat was shattered into countless fragments, what we now call the asteroid belt. The other half, reshaped by the impact, became the world we live on. It is a creation story. But it reads, in Sitching's translation, less like a myth and more like a description of a physical event, one that modern planetary science acknowledges is at least possible, that the early solar system was chaotic, that collisions of enormous scale did occur, that the current arrangement of the planets was not always as it is now. There is another text, older and quieter than the Enuma Elish, that contains what may be the most significant passage in all of ancient literature. Scholars call it the Atrahasis epic. Your audience already knows its ending, the Great Flood, the Ark, the survival of one righteous man and the world he carries with him through the water. But the flood is not where the Atrahasis begins. It begins much earlier, in a time before humans existed at all, in a time when the Anunnaki themselves were still doing the work of the earth. The text describes a class of beings called the Igigi, lesser members of the Anunnaki, the worker class, assigned to the physical labor of the planet. They dug the great canals. They moved the earth. They worked the ground in ways the text describes as grinding and relentless, on and on across stretches of time so vast they are difficult to hold in the mind. 40 periods of time, the text says. Some read that as 40 years. Others, working from the Sumerian unit of time called the Shah, which we will return to, read it as 40 cycles of 3,600 years each. 144,000 years of labor. Eventually, the Igigi broke. They gathered in the night. They burned their tools. They surrounded the great house of Enlil, the commander of Anunnaki operations on Earth, the one your audience already knows as the stern and unyielding God, and they refused to continue. The great gods convened in alarm. Something had to change. The work still needed doing. But the workforce had simply stopped. It was Enki who offered the solution. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep water, the scientist, the one who in every Sumerian story is slightly apart from the others, more curious, more compassionate, more willing to bend a rule in service of something he believed was right. Enki said that something new could be made. Something that could do the work. A being fashioned from what already existed on this planet, shaped and refined until it was capable enough to be useful, and given just enough life to fulfill its purpose. He called what he had in mind the Lulu Amalu. In Sumerian, the words mean the mixed worker. Not the created worker. Not the made worker. The mixed worker. Mixed from what was already here, and from something else. Something brought from elsewhere. That single word, mixed, sits quietly at the center of the whole story, and it has been sitting there for 5,000 years. There is one more document worth resting with before we move forward. Archaeologists call it the Sumerian King List, and it is one of the strangest things that has survived from the ancient world. It is exactly what its name suggests, a list of kings. Every ruler of Sumer, recorded in sequence, stretching back from the known and verifiable into a period before the Great Flood, a period so ancient that the reigns recorded there seem, to modern eyes, impossible. One king ruled for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. the 8 kings listed before the flood ruled, between them, for a combined total of 241,200 years. Scholars call these numbers symbolic. Mythological inflation, the way ancient cultures sometimes dramatized the greatness of their ancestors. And perhaps that is all they are. But Sitchin noted something curious about those numbers. They are all multiples of 3,600, the same number that formed the foundation of the entire Sumerian mathematical system. The Sumerians called this unit the Shah. It was written as a large circle. And the same word, Shah, was used to mean a completed cycle, a perfect orbit, and the number 3,600 simultaneously. 3 meanings, 1 symbol. A planet, a cycle, a number, all the same thing, all pointing in the same direction. If the kings of the pre-flood period were not human, their reigns measured not in human years but in orbital cycles, in the great slow turning of a planet whose year was 3,600 of hours, then those numbers are not impossible at all. They are simply recorded in a different unit of time. A unit calibrated not to the Earth, but to somewhere else. The planet that crosses. Nibiru. The word itself is Sumerian, and what it means is the planet of crossing. From an older root, Eberu, which means to cross, to ford, to pass through. Not to orbit, in the circular sense we usually mean. To cross. As a body whose path cuts across the path of other bodies. A planet that moves through the solar system like a traveler passing through, present for a time and then gone again, swallowed back into the dark. In the mainstream translation of the Sumerian astronomical texts, Nibiru is understood to be Jupiter, or perhaps a celestial reference point in the zodiac, a fixed positional marker used in early astronomy. Sitchin disagreed, entirely and specifically. He read Nibiru as a physical planet, a real body, one that moves through the outer solar system on an enormous elliptical orbit and only passes through the inner solar system, through the region of space where we live, once every 3,600 years. For the vast majority of its long journey, it is invisible to us. Too far away. Too cold. Too dark, out in the deep outer solar system where the sun's light barely reaches and where no telescope we have yet built has managed to look with any real thoroughness. It moves through the distant darkness for thousands of years, and then it begins its long inward arc, and gradually, over the course of generations, it draws closer again. To understand the scale of what Sitchin was describing, it helps to hold a few numbers gently in mind. The distance from the Earth to the Sun is what astronomers call 1 astronomical unit, a useful measuring stick for the solar system. Pluto, at the cold outer edge of what most of us think of as our solar system, sits at roughly 40 of those units. 40 times further from the Sun than we are. If Nibiru has an orbital period of 3,600 years, the length of time it takes to complete 1 full journey around the Sun, and if it passes through the inner solar system close to Earth during each pass, then the mathematics of orbital mechanics suggest that the far end of its orbit, the point where it swings furthest from the Sun before turning back, would sit at approximately 469 astronomical units from the Sun. Nearly 12 times further out than Pluto. Out at the edge of where our solar system ends and interstellar space begins. A planet that far out would be almost impossible to see directly. We would only know it was there from the way its gravity left fingerprints on the orbits of other, smaller objects at the edge of the solar system, a subtle bending, a quiet distortion that would only become visible if you were looking very carefully at the behavior of things you could see, trying to work backwards to find what you could not. In 2014, astronomers working at the California Institute of Technology began noticing something in the orbits of a group of small bodies at the outer edge of the solar system. These trans-Neptunian objects, distant, icy, slow-moving, were clustered in a way that the gravity of the known planets could not account for. Their orbits were being shaped by something else. Something with significant mass, sitting somewhere in the outer darkness, pulling on them in ways that required a very large and as yet unobserved body to explain. They proposed the existence of a ninth planet. A world roughly 10 times the mass of Earth, orbiting the Sun at somewhere between 400 and 800 astronomical units, on a highly elliptical path, one that would bring it, at its closest, relatively near the inner solar system, before sweeping it back out again into the deep dark. As of today, Planet 9 has not been directly observed. Telescopes around the world are scanning the outer sky, looking for it. And it has not yet been found. Which means that if it exists, and the gravitational evidence suggests that something does exist, it is currently somewhere in that vast outer darkness, invisible, moving slowly, on an orbit that may or may not bring it back through the inner solar system in a timeframe that has any relevance to human history. Nobody is saying that Planet 9 is Nibiru. That is not the argument. The argument is only this, that the Sumerians described a large body on an elliptical outer solar system orbit 5,000 years ago, and that modern astronomers are currently searching for precisely such a body, drawn to it not by ancient texts but by gravitational anomalies they cannot otherwise explain. The two descriptions, separated by 5 millennia, are describing the same geometry. Whether they are describing the same object is a question that, for now, remains open. There is one detail in the Sumerian description of Nibiru that stands apart from the rest. In the Enumeralish, in Sitching's reading, the great planet moves in retrograde, in the opposite direction to every other planet in the solar system. All 8 of our known planets orbit the Sun in the same direction, the direction determined by the rotation of the original cloud of gas and dust that gave birth to the solar system billions of years ago. Everything turns the same way, swept along by the same original momentum. A body moving the opposite way would not have formed here. It would have come from somewhere else, a rogue world captured by the Sun's gravity as it passed through, pulled into an orbit that was never quite the same as everything else around it. A visitor, a traveler that arrived, was held, and has been making its long slow journey ever since. Sitchin was careful and specific about the timing. He placed the last passage of Nibiru through the inner solar system at 556 BC, a date he arrived at through his reading of the historical and astronomical record. Adding the 3,600-year orbital cycle to that date gives a return of approximately 2,900 to 3,044 AD. In the year 2026, that is somewhere between 874 and 1,018 years from now. It is, to put it in human terms, roughly 33 generations away. The people who will be alive when Nibiru next passes, if Sitching's mathematics are correct, are as far from us in time as we are from the Norman conquest of England. From the First Crusade. From a world in which no one had yet heard of Genghis Khan or seen a printed book or imagined that the earth was round. There are other researchers, working from slightly different orbital periods and slightly different readings of the historical catastrophe record, who placed the last pass not at 556 BC but at 1628 BC, and using that as their starting point, they calculate the next pass at somewhere in the vicinity of AD 1984. Which, by their reckoning, means the approach has already begun. That Nibiru is already on its long inward arc, drawing closer with each passing year, still invisible, still silent, still moving through the outer dark. Others make a distinction that changes the timeline entirely. The Anunnaki, by any account of their capabilities, were not dependent on their planet's physical proximity to travel. A civilization that could cross interstellar space, that could engineer genetics, that could build the infrastructure we will come to in a moment, such a civilization could launch ahead of the planet. Could arrive by craft, independently of the orbital cycle, at a time of their own choosing. Some researchers have proposed that such an advance arrival, if it were to happen, would fall somewhere between the years 2090 and 2370. 2090 is 64 years from now. There are people alive today who may still be alive then. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before we move on. Why they came, the gold. A civilization old enough to have mapped the solar system before our species had fully formed. Advanced enough to travel between worlds. Capable, as we are about to explore, of engineering the genetic architecture of a new kind of being. A civilization like that arriving on a small rocky planet, and what do? They mine. This is the detail that stops you if you let it. Not the gods, not the genetics, not the orbital mechanics. That beings capable of all of that came here, to this specific world, and began extracting material from the ground. Sitching's answer is that the mining was not a simple thing. It was urgent. It was survival. Nibiru, in Sitching's reconstruction of the ancient texts, is a planet in a slow and ancient crisis. It orbits so far from the Sun that for the vast majority of its 3,600-year cycle it exists in near-total darkness, moving through the cold outer regions of the solar system where no sunlight reaches in any meaningful quantity. The warmth that sustains life on Nibiru cannot come from the Sun, as it does for us. The Anunnaki needed another source of warmth, another way to hold heat against their world across those long cold millennia. The solution they had found, or had perhaps always known, was gold. Specifically, gold particles suspended in the upper atmosphere, a fine reflective layer that would capture and retain whatever warmth was available and hold it close to the surface of the planet during its long journey through the dark. A thermal shield. A planetary life support system made from one of the rarest and most particular elements in the universe. This is not as strange as it first sounds. Gold has unique electromagnetic properties that make it ideal for exactly this kind of application. NASA coats the visors of astronaut helmets with a thin layer of gold for precisely this reason, its ability to reflect radiation while allowing light through. Spacecraft use gold foil as thermal insulation. The properties that make gold useful in space exploration today are the same properties, in Sitching's argument, that made it essential to the Anunnaki's survival across the cold ages of their planet's orbit. And Earth had gold. In quantities and in concentrations that no other easily accessible body in the solar system could match. The crust of this planet is rich with it. the riverbeds of southern Africa and the mountains of Mesopotamia and the deep reefs of the ancient ocean floor, all of it accessible, all of it valuable beyond any ordinary measure, to a civilization that needed it to survive. In the Mpumalanga region of South Africa, spread across an area roughly the size of modern Israel, there are ruins. Not ruins in the way we usually use that word, not the collapsed walls of known civilizations, not the tumbled stones of Roman or Egyptian or Mesopotamian construction. These are stone circles, thousands upon thousands of them, interconnected by channels and walls and terracing, built from the local stone, arranged in patterns that are only fully visible from the air. They have no doorways, no windows, no evidence of domestic habitation. They are functional structures, built for a purpose that is not immediately obvious when you stand among them. The researcher Michael Tellinger has spent years documenting these ruins, measuring them, mapping them, calculating their age from erosion patterns and soil composition and astronomical alignments. He believes them to be extraordinarily old, 75,000 years, by some of his estimates, or older still. And they sit directly above one of the richest gold deposits on the planet, a deposit that is still being mined today by some of the largest mining operations in the world. In the center of the stone circle complex, Tellinger identifies a structure he calls Adam's calendar, a circular arrangement of standing stones with astronomical alignments he traces back tens of thousands of years, possibly the oldest deliberately constructed human or non-human structure on the planet. Whether that age holds up under scrutiny or not, the scale of the surrounding ruins is real. The stone circles exist. The gold is real. The proximity is real. The explanation for what it all was and who built it remains, officially, unclear. The Atrahasis tells us that the mining was done, in the beginning, by the Igigi, the lesser Anunnaki. And it tells us what that work did to them across the vastness of time. For what the text describes as 40 great periods, the Igigi labored. They dug the canals that fed the Mesopotamian river valleys. They worked the mines in the south. They moved through a world that was not their home, doing work that was not their choice, under the authority of a command structure that expected obedience and offered no end in sight. Then, in the quiet of a particular night, they gathered. They burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's house, the compound of the commander, the one responsible for all of this, and they waited in the darkness with their torches and their silence, making clear without words that they were done. That the arrangement, whatever it had been, was over. The great gods convened. Anu, the highest authority, the ruler of Nibiru itself, was summoned. Enlil, furious, wanted the rebels punished. But punishment would not move the awe. Something else was needed. And Enki, as he so often did, had a different kind of thought. Enki had been observing the creatures of this planet for a very long time. The hominids, the upright walking beings who already moved through the forests and savannas of the earth, beings with hands suited to work, with minds capable of learning, with bodies that could endure the labor the Igigi had rejected. They lacked something. The depth of understanding, the language, the cognitive reach that would make them truly useful for what was needed. But that, Enki believed, could be supplied. What he proposed was not creation from nothing. The Sumerian texts are careful about this. The word is not create. The word is mix. The Lulu Amalu, the mixed worker. Take what already exists here. Introduce into it something from elsewhere. Refine the result until it is what is needed. Let the birth goddess Ninhursag carry the first ones to term, 14 at a time in the beginning, 7 male and 7 female, until the process is understood and can continue on its own. Sitchin reads this as a description of genetic engineering. Anunnaki genetic material introduced into the existing hominid line. The cognitive architecture of a more advanced species transplanted, selectively and partially, into a body already adapted to this world. The result was Homo sapiens. Was us. There is a detail in this that is easy to miss but worth returning to. The original design, according to the texts, was for a being that could not reproduce independently. A controlled population, managed in numbers, created as needed. The Anunnaki would remain in control of how many Lulu existed and where they worked. It was, in every sense, a managed system. Enki broke it. Enki gave the Lulu the ability to reproduce on their own terms. And then he went further. He gave them the tablets of civilization. Writing. Mathematics. Law. Agriculture. The administrative and intellectual tools of an advanced society handed to a species that had been designed to dig. This is the story that the book of Genesis distills into the image of the serpent and the garden. Enki is the serpent. The knowledge he offers is not sin. It is independence. And Enlil's anger, when he discovers what has happened, is the anger of a commander whose carefully controlled system has been given, by its own creator, the means to become something else entirely. The 3,600-year clock. There is a pattern in the deep history of this planet. It is not a pattern that appears in any official account of human civilization. It is not taught in universities or discussed in the standard texts. But it is there, laid out in the geological record, in the ice cores drilled from the ancient glacier of Greenland and Antarctica, in the growth rings of trees that lived and died thousands of years ago, in the sediment layers at the bottom of old seas. A pattern of disruption, of catastrophe, of something large happening to this world, again and again, at intervals that, when you lay them out and look at them, are remarkably close to a single repeating number. 3,600 years. Let us move through the record slowly, from the oldest to the most recent, and see what it contains. The youngest Dryas, around 13,000 years ago. In a period of perhaps a few decades, a heartbeat in geological time, global temperatures fell by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. The massive ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere became unstable. Coastlines changed. Sea levels shifted. The great megafauna of the Pleistocene, the mammoths, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed cats, the American horses, began to vanish, dozens of species disappearing within a period that, in the fossil record, is almost indistinguishable from sudden. The Clovis culture of North America, which had built sophisticated tools and spread across a continent, disappears from the archaeological record and is replaced by a different culture with no visible continuity from what came before. Something happened. The mainstream debates it still. A comet impact. A solar event. A rapid destabilization of the ice. The Nibiru cycle, counted backwards in approximate 3,600-year steps, places a pass in roughly this window. Göbekli Tepe, around 9,500 BC. In the aftermath of whatever the Younger Dryas was, in the hills of what is now southern Turkey, someone built a temple. The oldest known monumental structure on Earth. Enormous T-shaped stone pillars, some of them weighing 20 tons, arranged in careful circles and carved with animals and abstract symbols. The people who built it, by all mainstream archaeological reasoning, were hunter-gatherers. Pre-agricultural. Pre-ceramic. People without cities or writing or any of the organizational capacity that such a construction project would normally require. The pillars show astronomical alignments. The complex appears to have been designed to track specific movements of the sky across very long periods of time. It is not a settlement. It is not a fort. It is, in some way that archaeologists are still working to understand, an observatory or a temple, a structure built for a purpose that required precise knowledge of the heavens. And then, around 8000 BC, it was buried. Not by time. Not by neglect. Deliberately. Someone filled the complex with soil and rubble and sealed it beneath the earth, and it stayed there, hidden, until it was rediscovered in 1994. Who buried it, and why, is still unknown. The Black Sea flood, around 7200 BC. Marine archaeologists studying the floor of the Black Sea found something that the sediment had been hiding for a very long time. Beneath the saltwater, at a depth of several hundred feet, there is an ancient coastline. The remains of freshwater organisms. The traces of a shoreline that was once above water, once, in not so very long ago in geological terms, a place where people lived. The Black Sea was once a freshwater lake. Smaller than it is now, and several hundred feet lower. The natural barrier that separated it from the Mediterranean, the sill at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, held the two bodies of water apart. And then it failed. The salt water of the Mediterranean poured through with tremendous force, and the lake's surface rose, and its shores retreated, and the land that had been lived on was covered, quickly and permanently, by the sea. This is almost certainly the origin of the flood myth. Not one flood myth, all of them. The Sumerian flood of Utnapishtim that you know from our other episodes. The flood of Noah. The flood stories that appear in Hindu texts, in Greek mythology, in Mesoamerican traditions, in the oral histories of Pacific Island peoples. They all describe the same kind of event, a sudden, catastrophic, world-reshaping flood, because they may all be remembering, in the deep cultural memory of a species, the same thing that happened around 7,200 years ago, passed down across the generations in the only form that oral cultures have for preserving the memory of something terrible, as a story about the gods. The birth of Sumer, around 3600 BC. One full cycle forward. One Shah, as the Sumerians would say. And right here, at the precise tick of the clock, civilization appears. Mainstream archaeology has a term for this. They call it the Sumerian problem. It is an official academic term for the fact that Sumerian civilization arrived in the archaeological record without a developmental period. Without the slow accumulation of advances that we see in every other cultural emergence in human history. Before Sumer, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, there were agricultural settlements, modest and pre-literate. And then there was Sumer, already complete. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, legal codes, urban architecture, a civil administration of considerable sophistication. All of it present, all at once, as though it had not been developed but delivered. The Sumerians themselves, as we have said, had an explanation. They said the Anunnaki taught them. That the knowledge of civilization was given to them, not invented by them, handed down in the tablets of all the arts of living, by beings who already possessed those arts and chose to share them. Academics call this mythology. But it is worth noting that the Sumerians, who were present at the time and had no apparent reason to lie about it, did not call it mythology. They called it history. The Bronze Age catastrophe, around 1628 BC. One more cycle forward. And here the record becomes specific enough to name. In a window of time centered on approximately 1628 BC, the following things happened. In the Aegean Sea, the island of Santorini, a large circular island, home to the flourishing Minoan trading civilization, erupted with a force estimated at 4 to 5 times that of Krakatoa. The center of the island collapsed into the sea. A massive tsunami radiated across the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, which had been the dominant maritime power of the ancient world, collapsed within a generation. In the growth rings of ancient trees, oaks from Ireland, bristlecone pines from California, trees from all across the northern hemisphere, the year 1628 BC is marked with a narrow ring. The narrowing of a growth ring indicates reduced sunlight, reduced temperature, a difficult growing season. These trees were on different continents, separated by thousands of miles, connected by nothing except the sky above them. And all of them recorded the same bad year. In Peru, on the other side of the world, the ancient Sup civilization, one of the oldest complex cultures in the Americas, centered on the city of Caral, was ending. Geological surveys of the region show evidence of massive earthquakes, flooding, and prolonged environmental disruption in this same period. A civilization that had persisted for over 2,000 years simply collapsed, in the same narrow window of time. And in the Jordan Valley, in a city that archaeologists know as Tal el Hammam and that some identify with the biblical city of Sodom, there is a destruction layer. A single stratum in the archaeological record, published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 2021, showing evidence of extreme, sudden, intense heat. Pottery fused. Bricks melted. Sand converted to glass. Mud brick walls vaporized at their upper levels and left intact at their base, the pattern consistent with an intense heat source coming from above, an airburst event, similar in mechanism to the Tunguska impact over Siberia in 1908, but far larger. The city was abandoned after that event and not resettled for centuries. Multiple continents. Multiple independent data sets, tree rings, ice cores, archaeological destruction layers, geological surveys. All pointing to the same narrow window. All describing a world under some kind of unusual pressure, as though something large had passed through the vicinity and left its signature across the surface of the planet. 556 BC, the last pass. Sitching's own stated date for the most recent passage of Nibiru through the inner solar system. The year that Babylon fell to the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. The year that the long Babylonian exile of the Jewish people came to an end. A year in which the old world reorganized itself, the way it seems to do at these periodic intervals, old empires ending, new structures of power rising, the map of human civilization redrawn as though under some external pressure that requires everything to shift. The clock as it stands. Laid out in sequence, the pattern is this. A great disruption around 13,000 BC. The mysterious construction and burial of Göbekli Tepe around 9,500 BC. A catastrophic flood around 7,200 BC. The sudden, unexplained emergence of civilization around 3,600 BC. A global catastrophe around 1628 BC. The fall of the ancient world's greatest empire around 556 BC. And then, by Sitching's calculation, the next pass, the return, at approximately 2900 to 3044 AD. 874 years from now. 33 human generations. Unless, as some researchers argue, the approach has already begun. Unless Nibiru is already on its long inward arc, already drawing closer through the outer darkness, already leaving its gravitational signature on the small bodies at the edge of the solar system, the signature that the astronomers searching for Planet 9 are trying to locate and cannot yet find. The clock runs whether we watch it or not. The ones who stayed. Not all of the Anunnaki left. This is where the story opens into something wider. Into the thread that runs not just through Sumer but through almost every other mythology the human world has produced. The story of what happened to the Anunnaki who chose to remain on Earth, who chose, for reasons the texts present as a mixture of desire and defiance, to stay. In the Book of Enoch, a Jewish religious text that predates the New Testament, that is quoted in the Bible's letter of Jude, and that is considered canonical scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to this day, there is a story that the mainstream religious tradition has largely set aside, filed away in the category of the too strange to discuss. It is the story of the Watchers. 200 of them. Members of the Anunnaki, in Sitching's framework, the ones assigned to observe and monitor the human population from a distance, who descended to a place the text identifies as Mount Hermon, in what is now the borderland between Lebanon and Syria. They had made a pact among themselves, a collective decision to do what they had been forbidden to do. They took human partners. They intermarried with the population they had been sent to watch. And their children were the Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears in Genesis as well, briefly and without much explanation. The fallen ones, it is usually translated as, or perhaps those who came down, or those who make others fall. The etymology is genuinely ambiguous and has been debated across centuries of scholarship. But what the texts agree on is what the Nephilim were: enormous in stature, extraordinary in their capabilities, and deeply, profoundly difficult to manage. The Book of Enoch describes them consuming everything available to them in sequence, the agricultural stores of the communities around them, then the animals, then, when nothing else remained, the humans themselves. They were not cruel in the way that a story's villain is cruel. They were simply too large for the world they had been born into. Too hungry. Too powerful. An ecological catastrophe in the form of living beings, growing in number, spreading out across the ancient world. Enlil, in the Sumerian framework, saw in this the justification he had perhaps always been looking for. The flood that wipes the world clean in the Atrahasis, in this reading, is not a punishment for human sinfulness in the general sense. It is a targeted response to a specific problem, the Nephilim population, unauthorized, uncontrolled, threatening to destabilize everything. Enki, who knew what was coming, warned his favored human, the one the Sumerians called Utnapishtim and the Hebrews called Noah, and in doing so saved not just one man and his family, but the continuity of the human experiment itself. Beginning in the 19th century, American newspapers began carrying reports of unusual skeletal remains being uncovered from burial mounds across the continent. In the Ohio Valley, primarily, but also in the American Southwest and along the Pacific coast. Bones of unusual scale, individuals, the reports claimed, of 7, 8, sometimes 9 feet in height. Sometimes with skeletal anomalies. Double rows of teeth in some accounts. Skulls with unusual proportions. The Smithsonian Institution is frequently mentioned in these accounts as the organization that came to collect and catalog the remains. And the remains, in almost every case, disappeared into the institutional record and did not reappear. Conspiracy researchers have argued for generations that the Smithsonian pursued a policy of deliberate suppression, that skeletal evidence of an ancient population of unusual physical scale was removed from the public record because its existence would require a rewriting of human evolutionary history that the institutions of the time were not prepared to undertake. The Smithsonian denies any such policy. Mainstream anthropologists offer the reasonable counterargument that 19th-century newspaper reports of skeletal measurements are not reliable data, that large humans exist within the normal range of biological variation, and that the stories grew in the retelling. The debate has never been fully resolved, because the evidence at its center, the bones themselves, is no longer available for independent examination. In 1928, the Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello excavated a burial site on the Paracas Peninsula, on the southern coast of Peru. Among the hundreds of mummified individuals he found there were skulls of a kind that stopped him. Skulls with a degree of elongation that went beyond anything he recognized from his knowledge of the cranial deformation practices of ancient Andean cultures. Cranial deformation, the practice of binding an infant's head between boards to reshape it as the skull grows, was widespread in the ancient world. It produced elongated skulls. It was practiced in the ancient Andes, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in parts of ancient Europe. But the deformation it produces has specific characteristics. It reshapes the existing bone. It does not change the number of bones, and it does not significantly increase the volume of the cranium. The skull is the same skull, pressed into a different shape. Some of the Paracas skulls appear to be different. They have larger cranial volumes than deformation alone can account for. Some estimates place the increase at between 25 and 60% over a normal human skull. And a number of them appear to have a single parietal plate, the large bone at the top and sides of the skull, where a normal human skull has two. Deformation cannot produce a single plate from two. The bones are simply not the same. DNA testing conducted on samples from the Paracas skulls and reported by researcher Brian Foster in 2018 produced results that were never published in a peer-reviewed journal but were widely discussed in alternative research circles. The mitochondrial DNA, Foster reported, showed mutations that did not match any known human haplogroup. Not Native American. Not European. Not African or Asian. Something that sat, in the genetic analysis, slightly outside the known boundaries of what modern humans produce. The elongated skull tradition appears, it is worth noting, in several ancient cultures that had no known contact with each other. In the Amarna period of ancient Egypt, the royal family of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who abolished the traditional gods and introduced a form of monotheism, displays elongated skulls in its official portraiture, most famously in the children of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In ancient Malta, in the Canary Islands, in parts of the Pacific, a physical characteristic that appears, again and again, in the depiction and the physical remains of people who considered themselves, or were considered by those around them, to be closer to the divine than ordinary humans were. The conspiracy reading is that these are the traces of the Nephilim lineage, hybrid populations that survived the flood, dispersed across the ancient world, and carried their physical characteristics with them for generations. That the elongated skull was not a fashion or a spiritual practice but a biological inheritance, and that the cultures that adopted the practice of cranial deformation were not inventing a new shape for the head, but imitating one they had seen and revered in the beings they understood to be gods. The bloodline that runs to now. History, if you follow it back far enough through the right channels, has a way of narrowing. The great diversity of human civilization, the hundreds of cultures and empires and kingdoms that have risen and fallen across the recorded past, tends to converge, as you move backwards through the generations, on a smaller and smaller number of originating lineages. This is simply the mathematics of genealogy. Trace any two people back far enough and you will find a common ancestor. But there is a narrowing that conspiracy researchers point to that is more specific than ordinary genealogy. European royal families, when their lineages are traced with sufficient care, connect back to a remarkably limited common ancestral pool. Not eventually, as all humans eventually connect, but within recorded historical time, within the period for which genealogical documentation exists. The bloodlines of the ruling houses of Europe converge on a shared line that traces back through medieval royalty to the divine kings of the ancient Near East. To Babylon. To Assyria. To the Lugal of Sumer, the great kings who, in the Sumerian political understanding, ruled not by human appointment but by divine descent. The divine right of kings, the doctrine that monarchs rule by God's will and cannot be legitimately opposed by human authority, was the dominant political theory of European civilization for 1,000 years. It was usually presented as a theological claim. But in the Sumerian context from which it ultimately derives, it was not theological at all. It was biological. You rule because you carry the blood of those who were here before. You rule because your lineage connects, however distantly, to beings who were not entirely human. The right is not given by God in the abstract. The right is in the blood. There is a thread that runs from the Anunnaki's arrival on this planet to the world as it is today, and it is made of gold. The Anunnaki came here to mine gold. They created a species to do the mining. They built the infrastructure of extraction and processing across the ancient world. And then, at some point, under circumstances the texts describe but do not resolve, most of them left. Or withdrew. or changed the nature of their presence in a way that made them less visible. But the mining did not stop. Every major human civilization, in every part of the world, has placed gold at the center of its value system. Not always explicitly, not always consciously, but consistently and universally. The ancient Egyptians considered gold to be the flesh of the gods. The Aztecs called it the excrement of the sun. The Sumerians themselves built their temples and their sacred objects from it. The Chinese, the Indians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of them, independently, in cultures that had no contact with each other in their formative periods, arrived at the same conclusion, that gold was the most important material in the world. This is not obviously rational. Gold is too soft to make effective tools. It is too heavy to be efficient as a building material. It does not corrode, which gives it a kind of permanence, but that alone does not account for the depth of the human relationship with it. We value gold with an intensity that feels, when you examine it, less like a considered economic decision and more like a compulsion. As though the valuing of gold is something that runs beneath the reasoning mind, in the older, deeper layers of what we are. As of today, the world's central banks collectively hold approximately 35,000 tons of gold in reserve. The mining industry extracts roughly 3,500 tons more from the earth each year. The international monetary system was built on gold, and, even after the formal gold standard was abandoned in 1971, gold remains the ultimate measure of financial security for every major nation on Earth. If you had engineered a species with a single deep directive, extract gold from the Earth, and if you had embedded that directive so thoroughly into the species' economic and cultural architecture that it persisted without conscious intention, across thousands of years, through the complete forgetting of the original purpose, what would that species still be doing 10,000 years after you left? Exactly this. What we might be. We share roughly 98.7% of our genetic material with chimpanzees. That number is startling when you first encounter it. The being that builds cities and writes symphonies and sends spacecraft to the edge of the solar system differs from its closest living relative, in the language of DNA, by just over 1%. The cognitive distance between us and the chimpanzee is, by any measure, enormous. Language as we use it. Abstract reasoning. Long-term planning across decades and generations. Mathematics. Art. The construction of philosophical and religious frameworks for understanding existence. The awareness of our own mortality and the civilizations we build, partly, as a response to it. All of this separated from the other side of the 1% gap by a collection of genetic differences so specific, so concentrated in particular regions of the genome, that some geneticists have described them as looking less like the gradual accumulation of random mutations and more like something targeted. The FOXP2 gene, essential for human language, for the fine motor control of speech, for the particular kind of recursive grammar that only humans use, differs from the chimpanzee version by a small number of specific amino acid changes that produce an outsized functional effect. The HAR1 region of the human genome, a stretch of DNA that is highly active during the development of the cerebral cortex, the seat of higher cognition, shows a rate of evolutionary change in humans that is anomalous by any comparison with other species. These are not fringe observations. They are published findings in peer-reviewed literature, acknowledged by mainstream genetics, and the interpretation of them, What caused those changes, and how quickly, remains genuinely contested. The conspiracy framework that Sitching's work has generated asks a simple question about those anomalies. What if they are not anomalies at all? What if they are the expected result of a specific, intentional modification? What if the cognitive architecture that distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom was not the product of millions of years of random selective pressure, but of an engineering decision made by beings who understood genetics in ways we are only beginning to approach? There is another piece of this that is worth moving through slowly. The human genome contains a large proportion of DNA that does not code for any protein, sequences that do not, as far as we can determine, do any of the things that the coding portions of the genome do. Scientists originally called this junk DNA, a dismissive shorthand for genetic material whose purpose was not understood. That framing has shifted considerably in recent years, as researchers have discovered that many of these non-coding sequences are not inactive at all. They regulate the expression of other genes, they respond to environmental signals, they shape development in ways that are still being mapped. Some alternative researchers read these non-coding regions not as regulatory machinery and not as evolutionary debris, but as suppressed capability. Genetic potential that was installed in the original engineering of the Lulu Amalu and then locked, either by design, to keep the worker species from developing beyond its intended function, or as a natural consequence of the enormous genetic distance between what we are and what the Anunnaki were. A deep inheritance that sits dormant in every human cell, present but inaccessible, waiting for something, some condition, some event, some knowledge we have not yet found, to activate it. What we are, if this framework holds, is not a finished thing. We are the Lulu Amalu, the mixed worker, caught somewhere in the middle of what we were designed to be and what we might eventually become. Half of something older and stranger than any mythology has quite managed to describe. Living on a world that was someone else's mining operation. Following drives we did not choose and cannot fully explain. Counting down, without knowing it, along a clock that was running before the first human hand pressed the first mark into wet clay and called it writing. The Sumerians had a word, mi for the tablets of civilization. It referred to all of the arts of organized living. Writing, mathematics, the administration of justice, the cultivation of the earth, music, the building of cities, the keeping of records. Everything that separates a civilization from a collection of individuals surviving by instinct. According to the texts, the me were not invented. They were given. Handed down from the Anunnaki to the first administrators of the first Sumerian cities. Encoded in clay. Copied and distributed and built upon over the thousands of years that followed. Every system you live inside right now, the language you think in, the money that moves through your world, the laws that shape your days, the cities that hold you, all of it runs on code that was written by someone else. Someone who is not in the history books. Someone the official story of our past has quietly reclassified as mythology because the alternative is a question with no comfortable answer. The Sumerians built their cities and wrote their laws and mapped the stars with a precision that still holds up, and then they looked up. And they waited. Their texts say that the Anunnaki will return. Their calendar is built around a number that encodes the orbital period of a planet that modern astronomers are still searching for. Their king list measures the reigns of their earliest rulers in units calibrated not to the Earth but to something beyond it. By Sitching's own mathematics, the next physical pass is approximately 874 years from now. By other calculations, the approach has already begun, Nibiru already on its slow inward arc through the outer dark, drawing closer year by year in a movement that no telescope we currently have is quite positioned to detect. And if the Anunnaki themselves can travel independently of their planet's orbit, if they can launch ahead, arrive in advance, then the window that some researchers have proposed, between 2090 and 2370, is not impossibly distant. The closer end of that window is 64 years from now. There is no verdict here. There is no conclusion being offered. Only the story as the clay remembers it, told across the quiet of a long night, in the way that old stories have always been told, not to convince, but to carry. To move through the mind like water moves through stone, slowly, leaving something behind. The Sumerians built everything they had, and they looked up, and they waited. Perhaps they understood something that we have spent 5,000 years slowly forgetting. Perhaps the question was never whether the Anunnaki were coming back. Perhaps the question was always what we were supposed to have figured out before they did. Sleep now. The night is long. The stars are where they have always been. And somewhere in the outer dark, something old is moving.